Welcome to Successful Parenting, where we, Jackie Rue and Robin Choquette, share practical skills for families to build resilience and healthy connections. As practicing professionals and parents ourselves, we hope this podcast is a resource for parents to grow, reflect, and learn more about themselves and their children. Our approach is simple, tangible, and most importantly, we lead with compassion for the integrity of the families we serve. This podcast should not be taken as medical advice and is intended for informational purposes only. We love our work, and we can't wait to watch families gain confidence and open themselves up to new ways of successful parenting. Hello, Jackie.
Hello, Robin. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself? How are things going?
Good. It's a beautiful time of year. I am excited about our guest speaker today. He is one of my favorites. So that is something I've been looking forward to this week.
Yes. Every time I've heard him speak, deepened reflection of yourself, it's so helpful.
Yes. And our topic today, just really talking about the father-son relationship and the impact it has on our children. Mark Sanders, who many know, is an international speaker, trainer. He's called on a lot as a consultant all over United States, Europe, Canada, Caribbean islands.
Wow.
Yeah, I know the hospital system that I was with for a long time. Mark was called on quite frequently to be a speaker for us, but also for the neighboring hospitals. He's also authored 5 books and tons of different publications. He's received numerous awards and accolades, including a Lifetime Achievement Award. He does a lot with addictions in Chicago as well as other cities. Really a lot on just really how to support our youth across the board on all different topics. So I thought no other expert to have on this topic today than Mark Sanders.
Welcome, Mark.
And thank you, Robin. Thank you, Jackie, for inviting me to be a part of the podcast.
Yeah, this is a good topic. And I heard you discuss this before. What would you want to share about your background or your work that brought you to this interest in this topic?
Yes, and so I understand that lots of work that people do is based in their experiences. So here's what I like to share. Me and my siblings, we didn't get enough mothering because our mother didn't get enough fathering. What I mean by that is she was her father's favorite, but my grandfather was so intoxicated that you could smell alcohol coming out of his pores. Mm-hmm. And so Dr. Brene Brown says you can't selectively numb. So if alcohol numbs one thing, it can numb other things. So she didn't get what she needed from her father. So growing up, the men in my mother's life were put ahead of her 5 children. So there was neglect there. As a teenager, I had a summer job, a city job in Chicago. Mayor Richard J. Daley, the mayor of my youth, believed that every young person should have a summer job. And so I was placed in an agency called Jane Addams Center. And I was a youth worker, a young youth worker as a teenager working with kids. And it felt really good because I was able to give back to kids what I didn't get growing up as a kid. And there was a woman there named Arlene Rodriguez who told me she was a social worker. She was a street outreach worker, and she carried a beeper. I hope your audience is aware what a beeper is. It sort of
yeah, we may need you and I know that, but I don't know if everyone does.
Yeah, preceded the cell phone, of course, where your phone would beep, a number would appear, and then you would look for a payphone. In the 70s, to return the call. Back in the 70s, there were 3 people that I saw, 3 types of people that carried beepers. Drug dealers carried beepers, street hustlers carried beepers, and Arlene Rodriguez, the social worker. So I wanted to carry a beeper. And so I said I want to be a social worker like Arlene Rodriguez. So I went to school. I've been a social worker for 41 years. And one of my areas of specialization is working with men. Here's the other story. When I was in 3rd grade, my mother left my father. She said that his heart was too big for one woman. Let me translate that. My father had girlfriends. So my mother left him. And I didn't discover my father until after my parents separated. They had so much conflict when they lived together, I never saw my father. But when they separated, every Saturday and Sunday, from the time I was age 5 through the time I was age 13, 8 years, my father would pick me up. We'd go to work together every weekend for 8 years. It was predictable. I received my father's time. We bonded. We worked together. It was a simple job. We delivered newspapers, the Chicago Sun-Times and the Tribune every Saturday and Sunday. Me and my father, man and boy against the world, all year round, including the winters. We'd have lunch together. And the other thing my father did for me, and I think this is one of the roles of fathers, and we'll get deeper into it as you ask more questions. My father, when I was a boy growing up, introduced me to a community of men where I learned healthy male bonding. And so it's the opposite of toxic male bonding, which is dangerous and high risk. Me and my father and his friends, we worked together, we played basketball together, and we ate food outside together. So I learned healthy male bonding. So I received what I needed from my father for those 8 years. And then in my life as a social worker, I met lots of young men who never got what they needed from their father. So that became of interest to me, and it became one of my specializations to help young men who suffer from what I call father hunger, meaning he grew up and he didn't get enough fathering, or what we call father wound. Somehow the boy was injured by his father, mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, sexually, etc. So that's my background, which brought me to this work.
Wow. What an interesting life in terms of this disconnect. And then because of the separation of your parents, then your relationship with your father seemed to even deepen and get stronger. Why is it, do you believe, that father-son relationship is so important? And what happens when that's absent?
Well, there's a couple parts to it. One of them is that when fathering is working really well, he gives his sons and his daughters his time. And kids get it. What parents give their time to is what they love. So I have a challenge for all the parents listening to your podcast today. Fathers. We're focusing on fathers today. If you have small children or adolescent children, ask your children what they believe are the 5 most important things to you. You're their parent. And an eye-opener might be, where do they put themselves on the list? Are they number 5? Are they number 4? Are they number 1? Or do they make the list at all? When fathers give their sons time, it contributes to them feeling love. The other thing fathers provide for their sons is the modeling of what we call wholeness. I bring your listeners to a book by an anthropologist by the name of Robert Moore. The book is called The King, Warrior, Lover, Magician. King, Warrior, Lover, Magician. And Robert Moore traveled the world asking people to tell stories about men. And all over the world, people tell stories about 4 types of men. The king. The king has power, but the king doesn't abuse the power. They use it to bless others. They make sacrifices for others. In fact, the king might be willing to die for the people. Examples of king would include people like Mahatma Gandhi, willing to die for the people in India and sacrifice his life for the people in India. People like Nelson Mandela, kings. Robert Moore noted that people also told stories about the warrior. The warrior is the protector, the brave one, the hunter, the one who brings home the food. I'd like for you to think about an era, any part in the world a few hundred years ago where the teenage boy was sleeping in a hut next to his mother. And he would be awakened at age 13 by his father and other men in the village. And they would give him a bow and arrow and a spear and teach him bravery, how to hunt, how to bring home the bacon, the warrior. Robert Moore also noted that all over the world, people tell stories about an archetype, a male archetype called the lover. And the lover should not be mistaken for the sexual man. The lover is the man who can be vulnerable, who can hold a hand, who can cry, who can express fear. The lover, the compassionate man, the kind man, the man who can give a hug, the lover. And then the 4th archetype that people talked about all over the world is the magician. And this is the man who can pull a rabbit out of a hat, the great negotiator, the salesperson. So if there was a famine in the village and the warrior couldn't find any food, historically the magician would negotiate with other tribes to bring home food. Robert Moore said, each of these archetypes, the king, warrior, lover, magician, has a less mature version of the actual archetype. He called these the shadow. So the shadow of the king is the corrupt leader, the dictator, the corporate CEO, like the one from Enron who wanted to steal Granny's pension, the corrupt minister. They have power, but it's corrupt, the corrupt politician, the shadow king. The shadow warrior is the gang member, the rageaholic, the tough guy. The shadow lover is the womanizer, the serial affair guy, the pimp. And then the shadow magician is the con artist, the manipulator. And Robert Moore goes on to say that each of these four archetypes are present within a whole man. A whole man is part king, warrior, lover, magician, and he has to know when to lead with each. And the way he develops wholeness in an ideal world, he observes his father, who can cry, who can go to work and bring home the bacon, right? Who can bless others and make sacrifices, and is a creative problem solver. So that role is needed in order to teach young men to be whole. Another role that fathers play in the role of sons when sons are young is they teach them how to regulate their emotion. To go from how a boy regulates emotion, sometimes through physical activity or physical violence, towards a more rational way of regulating his emotions. The way he learns that is by observing how his father deals with conflict in the world. But what if he doesn't have that model? What if his only role models are shadow warriors, tough guys, and fighters? Then he learns to be physical in order to deal with his emotions. So then part of your question is, what happens when that relationship is not present? I'll tell you a story. There's a radio personality by the name of Howard Stern. And some people think that Howard Stern is the best DJ in all of radio. And one reason that people think Howard Stern is such a great DJ is because he does 5 days of radio, 5 days a week, that is, for 4 hours with no music. He's inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He never sung one song, never played one instrument, never played any music. He talked for 4 hours. So he was interviewed by David Letterman. David Letterman said to Howard Stern, "I hear you have daddy issues." By the way, rap singer Kendrick Lamar has a song called Father Time where he says, "I have daddy issues." Howard Stern says, "I have daddy issues." Here's the story. When Howard Stern was a little boy, his father would come home from work and he would sit next to his father trying to get his attention. His father ignored him. The father would just stare at the radio. He would ignore his son. So as a little boy, Howard Stern thought, if I could just get inside of that radio, I would have my father's attention. And if I'm really good while I'm on the radio, I'd really have his attention. The end result is Howard Stern was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's not the story of many of the young men who I work with who were deserted by their fathers. Many of them are filled with anger and rage, having been deserted by their fathers. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross taught us that one of the early signs of grief is anger. And lots of young men don't have a feeling vocabulary. So the anger builds up and turns into rage. And often he either harms himself by using drugs heavily to numb himself of the pain of having been deserted by his father, or he takes it out on others through violence.
God, Mike, there's so many interesting things that you just said. Just thinking about the importance. Do you feel like there's key years when it's imperative, or do you think it's just overall?
So I'll give you two time periods. The first 5 years of life. And Sigmund Freud would agree with that. And lots of psychologists would agree with that because those are the developmental years. So those first 5 years of life are really important, right? Throughout his life. But another period of time that's really important is when the young man is about 13 or 14 years old. Let me elaborate on that. So I left my mother's house when I was 11 years old. And I had all the residue that a young man would have growing up. Having left his mother's house at age 11, I had work to do. And immediately I moved in with my grandparents, my father's parents. But somewhere when I turned 13 or 14 years old, I felt an internal drive to be near my father. So I wound up living with my father at age 13. What I later discovered is historically all over the world, they have what's called rites of passages all over the world. There's a few of them left, like in Jewish culture, there's the bar mitzvah, right? And the bat mitzvah. But all over the world, historically, young men would go through an initiation, a rite of passage, when they were 13 or 14 years old. We talked about it. Sleeping in a hut near his mother, he would be awakened by his father, and older men in the village, and they would take him through these rituals, and he would emerge a man. So instinctively, maybe it was encoded in my DNA. At age 13, I felt like I needed to be closer to my father so he could take me through these initiation to help define what it meant to go from being a teenage male to a man. That's a critical period because when they don't get that from their fathers as teenagers, that initiation, or other positive men in the village or the community or the suburb or the city, young men will be initiated. They will turn to men involved in negative activities to be initiated. Gangs, drug-using subgroups, hate groups, etc., to go through initiation.
Yeah, what I'm thinking about, Mark, as you're talking is that connection and that relationship, right? And the importance of it. Can you talk a little bit about how it impacts, the cognitive, the social, the emotional development of the child, and how do we see that?
Right. So, of course, that when you have like a great deal of trauma from having been deserted, right,
Mm-hmm.
know that it can impact cognitive development and also social development. Like I'm a therapist who works with lots of young men, right? And sometimes there would be automatic, this natural kind of a resistance because why should I talk to you? You're not my father. My father deserted me, sort of a transference, negative transference reaction. But also emotionally. I should also say, in an ideal world, and I was conscious of this with my own son, in an ideal world, you would also model as a father, it's okay to express feeling. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to cry. Lots of young men are robbed by their fathers of a feeling vocabulary. They hear things like big boys don't cry or man up. How can he man up? And he's only like 7 years old, right? So what he's taught is that if you hurt, you have to keep all of that pain inside. So he's hurting because he's deserted by his father, so he keeps it inside. Alice Miller, who wrote the book The Gifted Child, in the book said, it's not the trauma that messes up kids. It's the lack of opportunity to talk about it. There are lots of young men who suffer from father hunger and father wounds who never get a chance to talk about it. And so it impacts their cognitive development, their social development. And then, of course, as they've been robbed of a feeling vocabulary, they're taught to keep it all in. Don't talk about it. If you do, you're not a man.
Well, and when you think about a father who is involved and, there's neglect, abuse towards the female in the son's life, what do you see when you see that? What is some of the impacts that you see on the child or the children or the family?
Yeah, so I think we've observed and witnessed that left unaddressed, sometimes these patterns have a way of repeating themselves for generations. I was working with a client, a young man, who slapped his girlfriend. Only time he had ever been invited in a relationship. And so we were talking about his life growing up. And he routinely watched his father, he witnessed his father physically abuse his mother in front of him. And it wasn't just physical abuse, Robin and Jackie, as you know, often where there's physical abuse, there's also verbal abuse.
Right.
So we'd also hear his father, while abusing his mother physically, verbally put his mother down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what he learned is whoever's the strongest has power. He never learned to negotiate in a relationship. So this young man also learned sexism from his father. So when he came to meet with me after slapping his girlfriend, this young man had an IQ of the level of a genius. He was going to one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and he refused to read textbooks that were written by female authors because of what his father taught him about the intellect of women. When he was watching sports, if the sports broadcaster was a woman, he would turn it off or turn down the volume. So he had lots of work to do. I would suggest to the two of you, Robin, Jackie, that every young man I ever worked with around domestic violence, it almost always came down to what he witnessed growing up. His mother being physically abused by either a father, a boyfriend, a stepfather. As a matter of fact, research says the great majority of men who are on death row in this country for murder, the great majority, witnessed the domestic violence of their fathers when they were growing up. One thing I haven't said so far is while we know lots of young men personalize it, they blame themselves. Brene Brown called that shame when they're deserted by their fathers. There's a small percentage who do not. I work with a young man and who wasn't raised by his father. And I said, tell me about that. He said he was a no good father like his father was no good. Had nothing to do with me. He didn't blame himself. So he was able to on to with his life because that self-blame wasn't there. But what I've talked with these young men about, whose relationship that they witnessed growing up with their father towards their mother, is the one way you begin to turn this down, is to revisit that relationship that you observed and what you learned. We should also say that lots of young men who were deserted by their fathers, raised by single parents, their mother, they never witnessed a healthy relationship between the two adults in their life. So they guess at what a healthy relationship looks like. Some of them turn to television to figure it out. And they're going to tell me that most of the relationships on television are toxic. They're learning this anew without role models. We like to put men together in groups so they can learn how to have healthy relationships with other men who are striving for the same thing.
That would be so nice. So often when we look at marginalized communities, we see that at such a higher incident.
Yeah, so what we talk about, I know psychiatrist Carl Bell talked a lot about community protective factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a wealthy white suburban community, there's lots of protective factors that might be present in such a community that could help mitigate some of the pain of like father desertion. As a matter of fact, cross cultures, on average, 50% of young men and young girls are raised without their fathers in the home. One of the reasons that Eminem was real clear that he wasn't competing with African American rappers for the African American audience. He was competing against Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake and the boy groups for the affluent and middle class white audience. And he talked a lot about what it was like to be deserted by his father. The music resonated. In the middle class neighborhood where I live right now, it's often the fathers that you see on the weekends taking their kids to the playgrounds. And so in an affluent, well-to-do community, you might have the presence of Little League baseball teams, soccer leagues, right? Where there are men who are coaching, right? Boy Scout troops. That's significant. I heard a Washington, D.C. judge say that in 25 years being on the bench, he had never seen a young man come before him on the bench who had been a member of the Boy Scouts of America. So there are some communities out there that are not affluent, that don't have abundance of jobs, low education, right? High unemployment, high crime. Those communities, too, suffer from the absence of fathers as well. But minus those other community protective factors, we can see greater challenges like gun violence within communities, gang activity within communities. Those kind of things may be present in such communities.
Mark, what would you say just to bring healing? I mean, what do you think in terms of if there is a relationship that's been fractured or non-existent, what are some ways to bring healing to that relationship or to the family?
And there's so many ways. And so there's therapy. So lots of young men go to therapy to heal the relationship that they didn't have with their father. So there's therapy. There's also lots of men's groups, rites of passage groups. Some of them actually are attended primarily by white men, and they often use as an opening ritual Native American drumming. So once I was talking to Native Americans about that, and they said because men across the world have lost their drums. So they begin these groups with drumming in order to recapture their drum. But in these men's groups, they get together with other men who want to be better fathers to their sons, better fathers to their daughters, better partners, better spouses. So they help each other to heal. And often, talk therapy can't get to the pain. So in these men's groups, they do lots of experiential therapy, letter writing, gestalt therapy, role plays. I'll play the role of your father. If he were here, what would you say to him? They heal together as men. They cry together as men. They make commitments to be better fathers and better partners and better spouses together as men. So I was involved in rites of passage groups with a group of African American men who had gone through these rites of passage groups in middle-class white neighborhoods. They decided that they also wanted to help African American young men who lived in urban areas, metropolitan areas, like the west side or the south side of Chicago, heal the pain from what they may not have received from their father. So using experiential exercises combined with like hip-hop culture, they created these rites of passages for these young men to help them to heal. One such young man caught my attention, if I could just share his story. When he was a boy growing up, he witnessed his stepfather beating his mother in front of him. Then the stepfather would also beat him. And this man developed alcoholism in order to cope with that trauma. And he went through treatment 6 times and never got into recovery. And he went on a weekend rites of passage retreat with other African American men. And they said to him, "How old were you when you witnessed domestic violence of your mother and when you were abused yourself by your stepfather?" He said, "About 7. He said, "How tall were you?" And he showed him how tall he was. And they asked him to get down on his knees. And then on his knees, he represented the 7-year-old boy who was abused by his stepfather and who witnessed the abuse of his mother at the hands of his stepfather. Then they had 3 men climb on top of each other's shoulders, and together they must have been about 10 foot tall. And they were symbolic of the stepfather, who the stepson saw as a monster. And he said, "Look at how big he is and how small you were. You were powerless in that situation." And that reenactment did something for him. And he's been in recovery for 15 years. That one experiential exercise and a rites of passage weekend.
Wow. It's just amazing. As communities, what can we do to support the importance and those father-son relationships? What do you think?
Well, some of these are privately bringing back rites of passage ceremonies. Mm-hmm. Figure out a way through our writing, through commercials, through podcasts like your great podcast, to really talk about the importance of the father-child relationship, the impact it has on daughters growing up and sons growing up. We could start to get fathers, better presence besides just that plain tie, right? School districts can, when they call parent conferences, can put efforts into making sure that they send the message that fathers are important to participate just like mothers. As a matter of fact, I looked at one study where daughters are concerned. When fathers attend PTA meetings and report card pickup for daughters, right? It helps to increase the grade point average of daughters in schools. But collectively, as a society, if we believe that role is important, then we can start to elevate its importance. When doctors call, they can call to speak to the father like they often call to speak to the mother where children are involved. Teachers like to speak to the father and the mother.
Mark, this has been such a great conversation and, just a lot to think about. I know Robin has some final comments and questions, but, I'd love to even continue this conversation because I think there's just so much more I'd like to learn and hear about it.
Yeah, we should continue this conversation. And I tell you, another type of work I've done a lot on is the father-daughter relationship as well. So at some point, perhaps we can segue.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Absolutely. Well, we are to the point of asking our questions. Mark, you can pick one of the three. Let me read you the questions and then let us know. Number one, what did you do as a child or a teenager that would drive your parents absolutely crazy?
Right.
Number two, what is the biggest difference between teenagers today and when you grew up?
Okay.
And number three, what does successful parenting mean to you? So you can pick any of those.
Well, the first one is simple. My father, in the 70s, he grew up in that hippie era. So he had these sort of necklaces and so other jewelry. I'd wear jewelry. It drove him crazy because I never had his permission. And I think I grew up in a time when children played outside and there was very little technology and we had a sense of community. And we have more and more children today who are growing up with technology and that same sense of community is not there. When immigrants came to America by way of Ellis Island 150, 200 years ago, they were living in tight dwellings, maybe sometimes 10, 15 people to an apartment, extended family. You knew people were around who loved you. So back then, when someone said they were going home 20 years ago, they meant to their tribe or to their neighborhood. Like when I was in college, said I was going home, I meant Chicago. Today, when a kid says I'm going home, he means his house or his apartment. There's more isolation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the smartest thing we can do is to begin to rally community around children so that they feel love. If there were a funeral today, you couldn't have it right away. You have to wait for the grandparents to fly in sometime from another state and the aunts and uncles. So there's more distance, less love. And then your third question, I heard a billionaire say, you are successful if the people that you want to love you actually love you. So when a parent and child, in this case, we're talking about fathers and sons, go through all the pains of that relationship. And by the way, I have a colleague, a therapy friend, who told me that when the kid is growing up, you can't be at your best as a parent if you need to be liked by them all the time, because sometimes you have to make unpopular decisions. But when you make it through the turbulent teen years, right, and you still love each other, and love is a verb, you want to spend time with each other. When you are in your adult years as a parent, you're in your fall or your winter, at that point, if you have a friendly relationship, that's success too. It's never going to be perfect because if parents are perfect, then they raise children to be perfect, and that's too much stress.
Yeah, I like it. Like it. Thank you so much, Mark. Definitely we'll need to do a part 2. Would love to hear more and focus on the father-daughter. I think that's so important as well. It has been a wonderful conversation. I think it's time to say goodbye.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. And as always, it's great having you on. It's great talking to you. And we will definitely follow up to do a part 2 because I think our listeners will definitely be asking about that.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Robin. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for joining us. And make sure to subscribe and like us to catch our next episode, where we will take you on a journey to find new ways of successful parenting.